My lesson was in conjunction with Caroline's lesson on the 4 seasons. Caroline's lesson was directly before mine on the seasons of summer and fall. My lesson at Casa de la Cultura was focused on the seasons of winter and spring. We chose to do a lesson on the seasons because Casa has a wide range of English abilities throughout the program. Even though they split into advanced and beginner sections, there is still a difference in abilities within each of those groups. The 4 seasons was a good topic because it was something that could be treated at a very basic level, such as talking about food and clothing, but could also be taken to a more advanced level, such as talking about the Earth's tilt and how that affects temperature change. There were a total of 8 students and about 12 tutors that attended my lesson in the advanced class. I hoped for a better turnout of students, but at a program that is optional on a rainy and cold day, I understand why there are not as many students as there usually is. Despite this, I believe my lesson was very successful. There were, of course, a few changes I would have made if I were to teach a second time, but overall, I think the students left with a wider breadth and vocabulary on the seasons winter and spring, as well as their ability to form sentences about the seasons. My essential question was, what are the differences between all 4 seasons and how do they affect different aspects of our lives? This question really encompasses both mine and Caroline's lesson. The approach that I implemented throughout my lesson was the LLC approach. This stands for Learners' Lives as a Curriculum. This approach really shines through in the activities and worksheets I had the students fill out, as well as the LLC worksheet that I used to assess their knowledge of all 4 seasons at the end of my lesson. The first season that I discussed was winter. My winter objective was, students will write about specific activities that happen in the winter. The MPI for this goal was that students will write 3 to 4 sentences about what people do in the winter using a word bank. Here's a worksheet that I handed out that follows along with this MPI. The word bank that they used was a worksheet that they previously filled out while I was teaching. This is a blank copy of the winter activities worksheet. I was going to collect some of my students' work, but they wanted to keep the activities worksheets to bring home. As you can see, I filled in some of the blanks. I wanted them to have a visual representation of what they were supposed to do. Here is a clip from my lesson of them filling out the worksheet.
So as you can see, you need to write that in on your worksheet to go sledding. Everyone get that?
I had great results from the 3 to 4 sentences they had to write. Here are 2 examples paces of work from my students. The student on the left was not as proficient in English as on the right, as you can tell by the student on the right using more advanced words. She talks about things such as making tamales in the winter, the word decorating for Christmas, and hanging out with friends and making pozole, which was a dish that she had talked to me about. But you can see on the left that, especially on the left, that my students took a lot of examples from my lesson activities worksheet, such as drinking hot chocolate, playing in the snow, and watching TV. They also talked about Christmas, which was a holiday I discussed in my lesson. In the following clip, you can hear a lot of them talk about how Christmas was their favorite holiday.
Some holidays in the winter, there are definitely more than just these holidays. But some of the holidays are Christmas, Hanukkah, my favorite is New Year's Eve, and Valentine's Day. Does anyone have a favorite holiday? It doesn't have to be one up here. My birthday. Do you have a favorite holiday in the winter? No. Does anyone have what? No. Does anyone else have a favorite holiday in the winter? Christmas. Yeah.
This shows that the students, for the most part, met the goals that I had in mind in terms of them completing the worksheet. Having known the students for a while, I know which students in the class need more scaffolding than others. I would try to go up to them while working on the worksheets and give them some one-on-one attention. Here's a video where I try to engage with one student that needed a little bit more assistance. As you can hear, she tries to speak in Spanish, and even though I could respond in Spanish, I try to respond in English and repeat the words that she is trying to say in English as well.
Yeah, they're different questions. So what do you like to do indoors? Nothing in the winter. What do you like to do indoors? I don't like winter. I don't like my favorite thing is watch TV. Me too.
The second season in my lesson was spring. My spring objective was for students to be able to apply their knowledge of spring from the lesson and write a short story about the season. My MPI for this goal was that students will write a small story about a fictional character in the spring using pictures to guide a story of his day. Similarly to my section on winter, I had a handout that described the spring activities I focused on in my lesson. Students were asked to fill in the activities when they came up on the board. Here's a clip of me reminding the students to write down the activities that they saw on the PowerPoint on their sheets of paper.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some spring activities and kind of ones more connected to Gettysburg. As if everyone has their worksheets and you can fill in the activities that are missing on the blanks there.
After completing my mini lecture on spring, I gave my students the worksheet on spring, which was my second assessment tool during the lesson. As you can see, the worksheets ask the students to write a story based on the pictures on the sheet of what Daniel does in the springtime. To guide the students of lower proficiency, I told them that they didn't need to write a complete story, but rather a caption for each photo separately. I think that this really took off a lot of anxiety for them in the lesson, as writing a short story can sound like a pretty daunting task. Here's a video of me telling them they could write captions.
Do you know this one in English? Yeah. You can write about that one first.
Pero es que esto es winter and spring.
Actually, she has a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Here are pictures of two lower proficiency students' work. As you can see, they captioned the pictures. Here are pictures of the work of some of the higher proficiency students. There are still some grammar and spelling errors, but they wrote the responses in the form of a story, like the directions asked on the paper. This assignment I wrote a rubric for. I would say that those who were able to write in a story form, the higher proficiency students, scored a 2 on relevancy and accuracy. They were able to apply the vocabulary they had learned and write sentences that related to the pictures. I would give them a 1 for clarity because in most of the sentences there were definitely some spelling and grammar errors that made the short story not flow as well as it could. The lower proficiency students, I would give a 2 for relevancy, 1 for accuracy, and 0.5 to 1 for clarity, closer to a 0. They wrote sentences that represented the pictures but struggled with the new vocabulary. They did not write in full sentences, so I cannot rate them very high on clarity scale because the sentences did not flow together. Overall, grading according to the rubric helped me to notice that I did a pretty good job targeting the key vocabulary, and the students definitely need some help with grammar and sentence formation. In terms of my lesson as a whole, I think I was able to incorporate each principle of language acquisition in its own way. The first principle that I believe I incorporated very early on in the lesson was to create a low anxiety environment. This is a principle that I find to be one of the most important to me personally. I really enjoyed taking the time to go up to each of my students while they were working on their worksheets and talk to them about what they enjoyed. Here are some examples of some conversations I had.
You can use your paper too if you need to. Here. That's a good one. That's my favorite thing.
I like to sleep. Yeah, I like to hide. With your family and your friends.
Yeah, yours is outdoors and hers is
By myself. You like. All the seasons.
What do you like to do?
¿Te acuerdas? Entonces, cuando es algo así, por ejemplo.
K. Yep. C.
Aquí tiene walk.
E. R. S. Perfect. Yeah. Daniel does his homework. The LLC approach helped me to be able to do this, since many of my activities were focused on what they do during each of the lessons. These were really great moments, but I feel as though the one shining moment in terms of creating a low anxiety environment is my activity on the snowball fight. Here's a video of the snowball fight activity. You're going to take your piece of paper and crumple it up and make a snowball. Okay, so everyone have their snowball. So now we're going to split the room in half. So if we could just have everyone split in different ways. You can go whichever way you want. And everyone needs to stand up out of their chairs. Okay. So if you guys all want to stand up.
Please show me your edge.
So this is the line. This is the line that we're going to draw. So you are team 1, and you are team 2, and you have 30 seconds to throw your snowball at the other team. We'll see who wins. Yeah, you can pick them up and throw them back.
How do you win?
How do you
Less
win?
snowballs on your side.
Oh, you want less? Do I pick
You don't want them. Get in the way.
Guys, hurry!
Uh-oh. 20 seconds. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop. All right, everyone. Everyone pick up a snowball.
I'm out of breath.
You got so much.
Oh my god.
All right. As you can see, I had each of the students crumple up their piece of paper and throw it across the room in teams to try to see who would have the least number of snowballs on their side at the end. I was nervous that my students wouldn't like the activity. However, this had to be my favorite part of the entire lesson. The students genuinely loved being active, even if it was just for a minute. Everyone was laughing and having a good time, and it set the scene for a very good rest of the lesson in a very low anxiety environment. Another principle that was at the forefront of my lesson was contextualized instruction. I made sure that almost every sentence I spoke during my mini lectures on each season had some sort of picture going along with it. In addition, I would try to point to the pictures to give a cue as to how the pictures and my words relate to each other. Here is a clip of me trying to do this. Sometimes, however, it's too cold in the winter, and a lot of people, like myself, like to stay inside and do fun activities inside as well. So some of those activities are to watch TV with your family, to drink hot chocolate, which is my favorite, and and to build a fire.
In addition, each of my worksheets, even the LLC worksheet at the end, had pictures that were already seen in both my and Caroline's PowerPoints to bring back the visual cues that they had seen previously. This also ties into comprehensible input because during my lessons, I tried my hardest to slow down my speech and stick to the basics of the concepts and what I wanted to say. Like this clip.
So, in the winter, it's when Earth, like we were talking about its tilt, the tilt starts to tilt very far away from the sun, even more so than fall. So the sun is not really that strong, making it really cold. As you can see here, the thermometer and the temperature starts to drop. And because of this, a lot of the plants die that are outside, and the leaves on the trees will fall off because they're so cold. And because of this, snow starts to fall.
I think that I could have been a little bit more repetitive with some of the activities, such as skiing, which is only really mentioned once and not brought up but for the rest of the lesson. I also think that I could slow down my speech even more than I did to help with the idea of comprehensible input. In addition, at the beginning of each season, I did play a video that showed a time-lapse from the season before into that specific season to help the students have a really good visual of the changes I was talking about. Here's a clip of this.
So now I'm going to play a quick video of the seasons going from fall into winter, and you can see all the leaves fall off the trees and the snow start to come up.
The last principle of language acquisition is meaningful engagement. I feel as though this principle goes hand in hand with my approach of the LLC for my lesson. I think I did a good job of relating such a simple topic such as the 4 seasons to the lives of my students. My spring activities focused on what people do in the spring in Gettysburg. I also showed them often about their I also asked them often about their family and friends as seen in my winter worksheet. A lot of things went really well in my lesson, but if I were to teach again, there were also a few things that I would definitely like to change. Firstly, I think that even though all of my worksheets were purposeful, I had too many of them for the time that my lesson was. I wish I had spent a little bit more time lecturing about the seasons because I really did not get to spend as much time talking about clothing or food as I wanted. I anticipated that the worksheets would be more engaging, but I think it got a little repetitive towards the end. And this is a clip kind of me stressing out a little bit about this.
Okay guys, so I have one last worksheet for you, I promise. And this one's going to be on all 4 seasons.
After seeing how engaged my students were after the snowball fight, I wish that I had made another spring activity that was more active for my students to do. All in all, I learned a lot about myself through this experience, but there are 3 main things that I want to talk about. First of all, in terms of CASA as a whole, I learned that I can be a mentor. I was really nervous about the language barrier going into this experience, and I was very skeptical that I was going to be able to teach them not knowing that much Spanish myself. And I learned that that is all part of the experience, and that being a mentor between myself and the student, there's something that I like to say is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think I really learned that there are definitely going to be awkward times, but that's what helps us to remember, for me to remember some of the Spanish, and more importantly, for my student to remember the English and remember that conversation that we had, or maybe there's a little bit of awkward tension, but in the end, we figured out what we were trying to say. Secondly, through my teaching experience, I learned that I can be a teacher. I was very, very nervous to teach a 40-minute lesson because I hadn't taught a lesson that length before. But I learned that I can do it, and I can get the attention of an entire class and feel confident about myself while doing so, which is something that I really appreciate through this opportunity. And lastly, and what I think almost most importantly, is that I can be a friend. I learned through my experience at CASA, especially through my experience teaching, that these people are my friends. We share a community together, even though I'm in the college and they're and the outside community, but we have a lot in common. So especially when I can talk about seasons, I can talk about what I do during the seasons, and it matches up with what they do during the seasons because we live in the same community. And this was something that I found to be really cool and really engaging for both myself and the students in the end. All in all, I'm so happy I had this opportunity to teach, and I wish that I could do it again.